listening to TribePod, a podcast series of interviews of interest to the HR community. It is hosted by Jim Stroud, sponsored by Proactive Talent, and enjoyed by you. Today's episode begins right after this.
Let's face it, we're in a whole new world now. We know that the reactive old way of hiring and the post and pray model is expensive, and it's getting more expensive every year. What Employer Brand does is it is a long-term strategy that will help you get better at hiring faster and at a higher quality.
75% of candidates will research a company before even applying, and 86% of candidates will not work for a company that has a bad or non-existent employer brand. Some of the many benefits of having an effective and strong employer brand include doubling the amount of applicants you get per job post, decreasing your cost per hire by 40%, improving employee retention by 60%, and overall just yield better Glassdoor reviews.
We know that companies with stronger employer brands spend about 10% less overall for talent.
Proactive Talent helps out clients with their employer brand by going in and working with them in several phases to learn more about the culture, the people, what are the important values to each and every employee, and then to share that story and refresh their employer brand or build it from the ground up. The benefits of having an effective employer brand is that you're going to be able to attract the talent that you really want to join your company, and not just people who would be simply applying for whatever requisitions you have out there. They generally love your message, love your culture, and are there to be with you for the long haul.
For more information on Proactive Talent, visit them online at proactivetalent.com or click the link in the podcast description. Hello, dear listener, and depending on when you're listening to this podcast, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to another exciting episode of TribePod. With me today is a very special guest. Special guest, tell us, who are you and what do you do?
Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Gray. I'm currently the head of hiring at Invisible Technologies. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. My pleasure. You know, we were having a rather interesting conversation just prior to recording about AI and how it has affected recruiting. I was reminded of a blog post I wrote some time ago, and by the time this podcast posts, I'll put it in the podcast description. But essentially what I did was I looked at the job advertisement for a recruiter in the year 2000, 2002, somewhere around there. And then I looked at a job advertisement from today, or I think from 2018, and compared the two. And although there was something that stayed the same, there were a lot of changes, and the root of a lot of those changes was technology, you know. And it made me, when I wrote it, it made me just wonder how much things have changed in recruiting because of AI. Can you speak to that? How has, in your opinion, AI been applied to the recruitment process overall in recent years as opposed to the year 2000, 2002?
Yeah, even based off that, you know, what's super interesting, you know, how technology has changed hiring. You know, you look at that historically, it's like, well, you know, one of the greatest inventions of hiring was the fax machine. You no longer had to send your CV in through post, and then obviously the internet arrived and job adverts, and then obviously LinkedIn, and you know, I truly believe AI is that, you know, the next fax machine of hiring. So I think what people don't realize is it's already been utilized heavily in the hiring side of things, and it could be as simple as, you know, CV screening within an applicant tracking system, even some machine learning elements to how to craft the most language neutral job specs out there. And, you know, in some case, you know, there's some AI-based hiring assessments. So multiple categories. One is video-based analysis of personality traits. Others are AI-based kind of logic and risk tolerance games. So it really is kind of exploding right now in terms of what people are benchmarking and what people are measuring and how they're utilizing it.
You mentioned bias in your commentary there. Do you think AI can really screen out bias? Because I hear this argument that Yes, it can screen out, so it's awesome, it's perfect. And then I hear this counter argument that, well, uh, computers or AI or whatever are programmed by human beings. So human beings have their own inherent biases. So it's going to come out in the tools they produced. What do you fall in that argument, in that debate?
Yeah, it's a question I get asked a lot, and I think it's more the structure of the question that interests me than the answer. But I will obviously answer, and that's, we have a tendency to go, AI is dangerous, it can be bad, and it has inherent flaws. And that's a true statement. But it's rarely said, is AI better or worse at bias than humans? And those are the two options when it comes to hiring. Either a human's going to check your CV and put you through the hiring process, or some form of AI is going to do it. And the research on this is actually quite clear. The London School of Economics recently published a paper essentially stating that across multiple studies, across multiple functions, and across multiple different varied AI tools, the AI was less biased than humans. So the answer is yes, it is definitely less biased. Is it perfect? And that's the question I usually get followed up with. I'm like, definitely not. We are still very much in the kind of embryonic phase of how AI is being utilized in hiring. It was 8 years ago when like the first idea even cropped out, and the first kind of beta models of AI in hiring were brought out. So it's still very early days. How long did it take to build an airplane? The first plane they built didn't fly too well. So we're in that kind of similar kind of structure where we've made huge leaps and bounds with what we can do. But there's definitely still a long way to go before we could accurately predict to a certain depth of understanding of how accurate those results are.
I remember being freaked out the first time I saw a chatbot being used in recruiting, and I saw how someone could book their own interview time, answer a few screening questions, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then I was thinking, okay, this is good on one hand. Other hand, oh, recruiters are done. The machines are taking over. Oh my gosh. But it didn't happen, of course.
Yeah.
What do you think about that initial fright when you first heard of chatbots or first heard about AI entering into recruiting space? Did you think that the end is near?
Yeah, I think my initial is, I think everyone, no matter what industry they were in, when they were like, "Whoa, what is this AI thing? Will I have a job in 10 years?" And I think there's definitely some people, actually some functions that are on their way to extinction, unfortunately, in the next 10, 15 years. One of the big ones being radiographers. I know it's a pretty niche one, but AI and image recognition software has really come a long way. But in the context of hiring, I think if you break down what hiring is to its core principles, you have to judge, is this person competent and will they have good output in the function you're hiring them in? And then you go, okay, well, what does that require? It requires the person doing this to know what exceptional looks like within this function, the ability to break down that function into all of its core components, and then replicate that in trying to figure out, can a human do this? So you're talking about hundreds of variables, and being able to judge those variables. Now, can AI help with some of that? Definitely. Can AI help with some of the more intangible aspects of hiring? Not in the next 10, 15, 20 years. And that's where my view is AI will definitely be supplementary to the hiring efforts, and make the whole, I think the talent market, if we look at it as a whole, the job market, people applying for jobs, quitting jobs for whatever reason, hyper inefficient. I think, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but there was some research done on essentially the efficacy of how an optimal hiring market would look like. And at the moment, it costs the US economy something staggering, like $300 billion a year, because
Wow.
it's so inefficient. So, people going down into a role where actually, if there was a competent hiring process, would have filtered them out, and then this person would have joined and then quit 6 months later. And then you have that productivity gap of, well, we spent a month hiring this person, 3 months onboarding this person. Now they've left. Now we have to start that again. So it is a hugely inefficient function globally. So anything that can aid in moving that needle, I'm all for it.
I hear some good examples of AI in practice, but I've also heard some harsh stories. I hear harsh stories a lot from Amazon. For better or worse, they're always trying to push the needle forward. I think that I read where they could fire people by text if they don't reach certain thresholds, and it's all automated when the manager doesn't even have to intervene. And then there was this other famous example, people were talking about it so much on Twitter and in conference chats, about how Amazon had this algorithm to find the best software developers, but because of the parameters they put in place, no women were considered among that. So it's like the software screened out women entirely. Kind of bizarre. Do you know of any other horror stories around AI or?
There's one that I won't mention who, but it's a US-based AI company, and essentially anyone that has a brief understanding of, very basic social science or very basic organizational psychology kind of looked at this product and like question marks immediately, because we were looking at it and going, how can they pull that from a video when, essentially academics can't even do it from a study? And essentially some of their claims were, from a short form video, we can deduce their level of intelligence. And that's very dangerous, because a lot of the companies that use AI in video, it's essentially based in, hard science, things like the big 5 personality traits. That's pretty much the benchmark for most modern psychology. Being able to measure that to a high degree of accuracy, it's pretty much, that's the entry point into this market. But I think when companies start to claim they can do things that essentially isn't empirically backed, that's when you need to kind of really worry about what kind of software you're using.
Sure. I've even have heard about a particular company. I won't say their name, but when you're looking at them on camera, supposedly they could, when the camera is scanning your face, it could pick up on the blood rushes around your eyes and under your skin and detect whether or not you've had a sudden rush of blood around a certain question, in effect making it sort of like a lie detector in a way.
Yeah.
And I thought,
I've seen this.
I don't know about that.
No, I'm like, even if you can, like that is a marvel of technological achievement. But I think if the premise of your hiring process is to see if someone's lying, you've kind of missed the point of what a hiring process should be.
Sure.
Yeah. So there is, but I think with any new space, there's going to be good and bad faith actors. That's just the history of capitalism. Unfortunately, is if there is a technological gold rush in a new vertical or a new industry, people are going to go and try and claim a percentage of the market. And I think it would be irresponsible for me to say that all of them have bad intentions. I think sometimes, it's naivety as well. So look, as I've said, there's definitely room for improvement in this industry as well. But I also think there's definitely a lot of companies and organizations doing phenomenal work.
Sure. Specifically, if you could talk about some of the things that AI does in the recruitment process. I've mentioned earlier about how a chatbot can help you book scheduling, but what other things have you seen or heard that AI can do in the process?
Yeah, I touched upon it a bit at the start, but I know there's some companies, large enterprise companies. I can't remember which organization now, but massive multinational, and I think they mentioned they receive something like 400,000 CVs a year, which is, there's no size of a recruitment team that's going to get through all of those.
Sure.
And they utilize some kind of AI to essentially benchmark candidates based off what's written in their CV. It's fairly rudimental. It's, keyword searches, sentencing structures, looking for, written language capabilities. So that's what some of the bigger organizations are using. As I mentioned, there's some AI tools on assisting companies on how they write job specs, so they're not using any biased language or using any gendered language or any language that historically kind of attracts a certain type of person, which is it's an interesting space as well. The big one is obviously the video based assessments. That's kind of one of the biggest markets, and the utilization of AI is it possible for us to extract some type of information without a recruiter having to spend 30 minutes screening a candidate. Those are the kind of main three. I know there's, I said, some like gamification utilizing AI. So I remember seeing one which is like, oh, there's a certain pattern as to you hit the space bar and the balloon fills up, and if you hit it too many times the balloon explodes, and then you figure out the pattern, and then they'll see how close you are to blowing up the balloon while the time ticks down to see what your risk tolerance is. So there's certain gamification aspects that they're utilizing AI with as well. But I'm sure there's a few I missed, but the main kind of area is focused heavily on AI training and AI recruitment through video.
When you mentioned that bit about the balloon, it reminded me of a case study I've read, and I always quote it because I'm just so enamored by the results they received. I think it was Unilever. They hired like 500 students out of college with this technique. They posted a job online, and it actually wasn't even a job. It was an invitation to play a game of some sort, if I remember correctly. You come to this website, you play a series of games, takes about 15 minutes, and they're assessing your skill sets and I guess doing things like the balloon thing you're talking about. And then you get a certain score, and then the people with the highest scores are invited to interview via HireVue. And so you answer some pre-screening questions that way. And then those who score well there get to meet with the hiring manager, and then they're hired on the spot after they have a personal evaluation. And I thought, man, that is awesome. And I always like quoting that case study, but what I haven't seen, and I would love to see this, and maybe you've heard of it somewhere, a company that has implemented a lot of AI in their recruitment process, but then checking on them maybe 90 days, 30, 60, 90, a year later to see how much of those people have they been able to retain on the workforce. Because I see studies and I hear a lot about AI making recruitment process better, but how is it, what's the impact on retention? Have you heard of anything like that or seen anything along those lines?
Yeah, so I think it depends how you work the problem back. So I think one of the strengths and how I've utilized it in the past is, to form the basis of what you're trying to hire for, you need to understand why your best people are your best people, deeper than the surface level. So if you can build that image up and then try and replicate it in certain tasks, especially like tasks with a tangible output. So sales is a great example. There's a very clear correlation to how people are performing. In terms of retention, so that's where it gets a bit more complicated, because hiring, my general view is if someone leaves within the first 3 months of them joining, that's a failing on hiring. Anything after that, it's a variety of reasons. It could be the manager, it could be the culture, it could be changes in how the company was doing things. There's a million reasons. So I think retention is actually a much more complex issue, because if you look at what was it? It was Tet that did the personality trait-based model of performance, and he goes, okay, so if we look at how people perform, it's like you have their core traits, how that interacts with the tasks they do, the variety of those tasks, the team dynamics, and team dynamics is like very complicated because it's like, well, how does one person's interaction affect their work based off that person's interaction based off their traits? And then, it also feeds into their like intrinsic and extrinsic reward centers, and then that judges what output looks like. So when you put all these together, it's like, how does a person stay in a business for less than a year? Well, obviously there must be some critical breakdown in some of these factors. So, maybe this manager had a certain personality type that favored people that were highly agreeable, but this candidate came in and they were very disagreeable. And there was clashes based off of that. And thus, you have something called like the chameleon effect, where you go, well, I think this person probably isn't good, and thus I will treat them like they're not very good. And the person I do think is good, I'll treat them like they're amazing. And there's actually some, performance enhancement and reductions because of that, because then the individual thinks, oh, I must not be good because I'm thought of so little. So, it's really hard to nail. Like, retention is a really complex problem. And I don't see AI fixing that in the long run, unless you could, tangibly link retention with certain key factors. So maybe, as I said, like someone's reward center. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Do people that stay in business X for over 3 years, is part of their intrinsic reward center somehow tied to the culture or the type of work? And if you can prove that, that's really exciting. Right?
Yeah, and then as you were saying that, I was thinking there are other factors that I don't think could be quantified in any kind of algorithm, like who could anticipate a pandemic or a war in Ukraine, or on a personal level, when someone's going to fall in love and decide to move to another city or country.
So that's a great point. And, technology will only take us so far. I'd say what the heart wants is far more complex than action. Yeah.
When usually when topics of AI around recruitment comes up, I noticed that there is a lot of attention on the ATS system from job seekers, and they're saying, okay, what keywords can I put in my resume to make sure that the robot picks me up? It makes me sort of wonder, what should companies say, or what kind of disclaimer maybe they should develop for the sake of job seekers? Saying, hey, we use fancy robots and algorithms to decipher the best candidates for us, and then some job seekers may see that and be like, I feel swindled in a way. If your machine doesn't find me, how do I know I'm going to get a fair shot? So it's I can see how it all makes it easier for the company, but for the job seeker, I imagine they are a bit nervous about it. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I'd firstly challenge the assumption that even if there was an AI, they'd get a fair shot. I wouldn't even know how to define what a fair shot looks like anymore. I think hiring these days is just so difficult, both from a candidate's point of view and a recruiter's point of view. As I mentioned, when you break down the core components of what hiring is, like, no one really knows how to hire. It is so complex. We have some guiding, some North Stars as to, best practices, but no one truly really knows how to hire properly with all the complexities involved. We can do it to a percentage. We can get it to a point. But from a candidate perspective, I understand that fear. I personally, we don't use any AI CV scanners or anything like that. On the flip side, I think it would actually, there's a huge opportunity in the market for a company to, ping certain companies' job sites to see if they use AI and have like a best practices section for candidates oh yeah, this type of AI favors X, Y, and Z. Use these keywords. But I think there's going to be an evolution, because essentially the benchmark of AI CV scanners assumes that A, CVs are accurate, B, CVs tell a full story, and C, CVs can predict future performance, which is, once again, that's been clearly debunked. Past performance is no reflection of their future capabilities. So it's also why I think AI in general is a tool. And if you use the tool correctly, you get, great output. If you use the tool poorly, you will get poor output. And I think that's actually the bigger disclaimer, that AI has this like really weird paradoxical kind of marketing about it, where on the one hand it's like, oh, it's the great savior, it's going to figure out all the things us humans can't and make everyone's lives easier. But at the same time, it's also this, force for evil and we should be afraid. But no one really talks about, like, it's still a tool, and if you don't set it up correctly, you're not going to get anything useful out of it.
Yeah, I tend to think of AI and recruitment. I made the comparison that it's not the Terminator. It makes us all Tony Stark. Well, we're all like Iron Man. It's a tool, like a tool of armor that we could use, but ultimately we're making the decisions. Some of the things that I like about AI as well is that, and I've heard this argument from the beginning, and I think it still holds true, is that it allows the recruiter more time to do things that AI presently can't do, and ideally would never be able to do, such as manage relationships. Recruiting is all about relationships. You got to be able to talk to the person, convince them that your opportunity is better than the one they're already in. You got to have a managed relationship with the hiring manager, convince them that, this person you found is awesome, they'd be perfect for this role. I don't see any kind of algorithm or technology being able to facilitate that human interaction to the point where people have a gut feeling and say, yes, I feel it in my gut, this is the person I need to hire. I don't see machines doing that, do you?
No, I kind of, gut feeling is a dirty word in the recruiter world. But second to hiring, like, I think gut feeling is something you earn. If you've been a hiring manager for 20 years, it holds a lot more water than a new graduate. So, but yeah, I get the point you're making, and completely, and that's going back to, like, AI is still, like, it's so early, and how would you even? I couldn't even begin to fathom how you would build that kind of neural network to teach human interaction. A sentient AI recruiter. I don't think we're anywhere near that. I don't even know if we can ever get there. Maybe in like 200 years or something. But the impact of the personality and who you are and how you come across, it still holds a lot of weight. At the end of the day, an AI can give this person a score, but even if this person scores highly, but they're a nightmare to interview, and you're like, God, do I want to manage this person? There's still some human traits that will always kind of balance it out. But I think also, one thing that doesn't really get talked about is, most developing worlds, the birth rates are down. I think the US is, for the first time ever, had more deaths than births last year.
Yeah, we're in that, I think it's called super aged nation status. We're getting close to it, where like over 20% of the population is over 65 or something like that.
Yeah. So, the amount of people in the job market is going to decrease significantly over the next 20, 30 years.
Sure.
So I even think the bigger question is, yes, AI in recruitment is hyper useful, but how does automation play into the future of jobs in terms of tasks? And I guess, segue, that's essentially what Invisible is focusing on heavily. But also, yes, AI will help people, help companies find jobs. But I think the reverse of it is going to be true in the future as well, is how will AI help candidates find jobs? Because if we're seeing a huge decrease in the workforce, the one thing that we're going to have to tackle is that inefficient marketplace. As I said, $300 billion a year, that's significant. So what can we do to move the needle at both ends, both from an employer perspective, but also a candidate perspective? And I think that's a space that really hasn't been explored extensively yet, is could we get to a point where, candidates and companies are all on this unified platform? We can read what a candidate wants, what their rewards are, what their traits are, what they're competent at, and match them up with businesses where they'll actually be like hyper fulfilled and really highly engaged, and thus have a very strong output. So I think that's also an interesting perspective that doesn't really get discussed a lot.
Yeah, I think that would be the next killer app if someone could develop that. The only thing close to what I think you're suggesting that I have seen is this tool called Esther Bot. Now, Esther Bot is a chat bot that I think a software developer created because they were getting inundated by recruiter requests to talk about software developer jobs. I think it was software developer jobs. And so what they did was they said, hey, instead of talking to me, talk to my chatbot first, because the chatbot can answer all the frequently asked questions I get, and then if you get past the robot, then we'll talk.
Yeah.
I thought that was pretty brilliant. At the time, and maybe even now, I see that as a tool for people who are constantly being harassed, so to speak. I won't say harassed, but constantly approached by recruiters. So I tend to think software developers. But for the average Joe, I don't know. I think it would be really cool if someone could develop something that would find a job for the candidate, or at least find opportunities.
Yeah, and even that whole process, hiring is very inefficient. You pick 100 people, maybe 3 or 4 get back to you. So, and that's part of the bigger problem. But, imagine a scenario where you get matched from a job perspective, a function perspective, a growth potential perspective, but also a compensation perspective, because that's where some of the inefficiency lies as well. It's like, oh, well, can I make more here? Will I be more happy there? And figuring out that mess, that's the kind of next, the next great implementation of AI. But I still feel we're quite far away. One thing we are close to, which is very interesting, is with all this trade analysis software. I spoke to one of the CEOs of one of these companies. He's like, we're essentially 1 or 2 years away from being able to identify dark traits. So things like narcissism, psychopathy, Machiavellianism. He's like, we're not far away from that. I thought that was very interesting because the initial reaction is going to be, oh, this is terrible. There should be something should be discussed, but I was just thinking, well, in some roles, that's actually a positive. So it's like,
Can they put that in a dating app?
So I think it's. I think that there's some crazy things in the pipeline for not just, as I said, job seekers, but maybe even for dating apps. So yeah, it's an interesting place to be in right now.
Most definitely. I think that until AI and machine learning can learn intuition, I think human beings are going to be okay, because I can see setting up a process to create a phone. You're making iPhone 10, 12, whatever the number is nowadays. You're making the next iPhone. But having a machine constantly crank out iPhones is not going to give someone inspiration to make the next Samsung phone or the next whatever else phone. Because that takes intuition, takes an idea, takes a creativity. And I can see machines imitating creativity, where, we put in different variables that may appear random, whatever, but they're not truly random because someone programmed them at some level. Sure. So until machines are sentient, like I don't know, Data on Star Trek or some other sci-fi show, I think recruiters are going to be okay. I have really enjoyed this conversation. If someone wanted to reach out to you personally and continue the conversation on, how can they find you online?
I'll set up a chatbot that they can reach out to. They can reach out to me on LinkedIn, Mark Gray, Gray. Feel free to reach out. Happy to have a lively discussion about the future AI and hiring, or just any general questions of how I utilize it and implement it. And yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
Pleasure was mine. Thank you again, sir.
Thanks.
Thank you 1,000 times. Thank you for listening and subscribing to our podcast. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please send them to us. You can reach us at TribePod, that's TRIBEPOD, @proactivetalent.com. We look forward to hearing from you.